Hello, I'm Tim Smith with the Adams County Historical Society, and welcome to another episode of Monuments Monday. And yes, again, we're talking about monuments and markers and tablets on Big Round Top. And at the moment, I'm standing what we refer to as the saddle between Big Round Top and Little Round Top. And this area is actually where the attack on Little Round Top on July 2nd came from. As a matter of fact, I'll show a drawing here from the 1870s. It was a drawing that was created as an engraving in one of John Batchelder's books. And it actually shows the Alabama Brigade and the Texans charging up Little Round Top with Vincent's brigade up there on top of that spur we refer to. Now, on July 3rd, the Union Army occupied this area. They built a stone wall. As a matter of fact, if we look on some of the early maps of the battlefield, I'll show you here, this stone wall ran up and over Little Round Top, and it was a continuous stone wall here all the way to the summit of Big Round Top. And there were various units positioned behind this stone wall on July 3rd, and these units skirmished with Southern units that were positioned near the Devil's Kitchen and beyond, probably like 100 yards out there through the woods. And you know, not enough attention is given to these units. In front of us are the 10th Pennsylvania Reserves, the 39th Pennsylvania Infantry. Remember the rule that you take the reserve number and just add 29 to it to get the Pennsylvania number of the line, and the 9th Pennsylvania Reserves. And there's a great story here about this sharpshooter action that is told in the Gettysburg newspaper. And I like how the paper starts this particular story. And if I remember correctly, it's after the 1938 reunion. You don't need to believe this one if you don't want to. It was told by a former battlefield guide. It seems that this guide was driving a truckload of veterans around the battlefield some years ago. As they were passing Big Round Top, a Union veteran jumped up on the back of the truck and shouted, "Over there's the rock I was hiding behind, trying to pick off a Confederate during the battle." Up popped a Southerner saying, "Yes, and I'm the guy you were shooting at." The former guide then related the story as it unfolded. These two men were hiding behind rocks, attempting to kill each other. After 12 shots, they became disgusted, and by mutual agreement, stacked their rifles against the rocks and walked out to the middle of the field to see why they were getting no results. They concluded that both were shooting so accurately that the bullets were meeting in midair and falling to the ground. So another unit associated with this sharpshooter action is the 9th Massachusetts, sometimes called the Irish 9th, or I've seen them referred to as the Bloody 9th, from Boston. And this unit was part of Schweitzer's brigade. And in the early morning of July 2nd, they were actually pulled out of the brigade and sent onto the skirmish line near Brinkerhoff's Ridge. And for that reason, they didn't return to the unit prior to entering the fighting at the wheat field. So this particular unit was not engaged in the wheat field action when the rest of Schweitzer's brigade was just overwhelmed in that fighting and driven out. But they did suffer 26 casualties at the battle on the skirmish line here or on the skirmish line on July 2nd, which I think is very telling. And here is view of the dedication ceremony of this monument, I believe in June of 1885. But you can see the monument here with the woods of Big Round Top behind it. That's the reason the monument's here, because they weren't in the wheat field, and the other units of Schweitzer's brigade have their monuments in the wheat field where they fought on July 2nd. There is a fascinating photograph taken right here. It's from the Gettysburg Museum of History, our friends on Baltimore Street, and it shows this area with a sign for Confederate Avenue, and you can see that rock clearly in the left of the photograph that sits up on top of the hill behind this monument. And in that photograph, the road passes right through here and not at its current location some 30 yards away behind the camera position. And that makes sense, and in a future video I'm going to talk about the road system around Big Round Top and how it's been altered over the years. So an aspect of Big Round Top that I found very interesting when I was first studying this area is something we refer to as the Old Veterans Trail. And one can only imagine that on the morning of July 3rd, 1863, upon daylight, the units that were positioned in this area built a stone wall. They probably cut down trees as a field of fire, and when we say troops, we're talking about thousands of troops being positioned from the summit of Big Round Top down across the saddle over to Little Round Top. And they built a very formidable defensive position. Now, you might say, well, Big Round Top was not attacked on July 3rd by the Southern Army, but remember, Lee's original orders were to move Pickett into position and have Hood and McLaws attack once again on July 3rd, and this would have been the scene of heavy fighting. So they were prepared. But can you imagine the road that must have been created here behind these breastworks all the way to the summit of Little Round Top, because thousands of troops moved up and then down this particular area behind the Union lines. And almost immediately after the battle, we had visitation to Gettysburg. And I already mentioned that they put a flagpole on Big Round Top as a memorial in 1863, and people were visiting the top of the hill. They could walk along and see the Union entrenchments that had been built by the soldiers during the battle. And so people were coming out to this area and visiting Big Round Top early on after the battle. And it wasn't before long that people realized that they needed a more formal trail. So a trail was put on the side of Big Round Top to the summit by the Gettysburg Battlefield Memorial Association. And Big Round Top was one of the early purchases of the GBMA. And when the War Department took over this area and they put in a new Confederate avenue that led around into this area, they decided to make it an even more extravagant path. And we're going to show this image from 1899 showing exactly where I'm standing. I am on one of the steps that was placed here leading to the top of the hill. And you can see this rock in the image. The brigade plaque for Joseph Fisher's brigade was not put in until the early 1900s, so it does not appear in this image. But if I remember correctly, it was the Farrell brothers that put 116 concrete steps along a walkway that slowly led to the very summit of Big Round Top, where especially in the winter winter, you could look out from the top of the hill and just get an amazing view of the area. I'm going to show a map right here that shows the path to the top of Big Round Top as used by early visitors and veterans when they came to the battlefield. And I have an 1882 drawing of veterans walking up this path during a reunion to see the top of the hill. The issue was that the steps on the path over time required maintenance, and because we're on Big Round Top, trees would occasionally fall across the path. So at some point, the National Park Service decided, after they took over, to eliminate the Veterans Path to Big Round Top and put in a new, more modern and efficient path to the top of the hill with a little parking area. And there's an article about it in the Gettysburg Times in the summer of 1940. And it talks about how the CCC put a new path to Big Round Top so that you climb up to the top of the hill. Tourists used to have to mount more than 100 stone steps up the old concrete and stone path which wound to the top of the highest point on the battlefield. But a new walkway slopes steadily upwards without a single step after a few broad ornamented steps that lead from the avenue to the beginning of the trail. The new path, which is about the same length of the old course, has a base of crushed stone with a stone chip top. Completion of the walk, which has been under construction for many months, awaits only application of a coat of oil to hold the stones firmly in place. It's interesting that they put such a positive spin on it. I understand that the newer path, which of course is the one that I used when I first came here, doesn't require steps, but it is much, much steeper, and it is very unpopular, and very few people use it because of the way it is designed. This was a much better path, and this path took you up by several monuments that were placed by the Union Army and the veterans, and by the original stone wall built by the soldiers that fought at the battle. So that one leads up the side of the hill. You see nothing, and it's steeper and harder to climb. And we'll talk about the ramifications of that in another video. One last thing from here. Of course, this path eventually led to a tower that was built on top of the hill that we'll cover in an upcoming video. Remember, if you like the content that we continually put on our YouTube channel, please like and subscribe.